I stood there watching Sheriff Corinne tear through my truck like a woman possessed, throwing my hunting gear across the gravel road. My hands were cuffed behind my back, and my 15-year-old daughter was crying in the passenger seat. Corinne held up a crumpled piece of paper with a cruel smile on her face. "Well, well, well. Looks like your hunting license expired 3 days ago," she said, even though I knew it was valid for another 6 months. That was the moment I realized this woman would destroy my life just because she could. And that was the moment I decided to destroy hers first. For 15 years, I had followed the same ritual every October morning. I would wake up at 4:30, make coffee in the darkness of my kitchen, and drive the winding mountain road to Miller's Valley. The land belonged to old Frank Miller, but he had always welcomed hunters who respected his property and followed the rules. I was not just any hunter. I had been licensed for 23 years. I knew every regulation, every season date, every tag requirement. Hunting was not just a hobby for me. It was a connection to something deeper, something that reminded me who I was before life got complicated. The valley was my sanctuary. Tall pines stretched toward the sky, and a small creek ran through the center of the clearing. I had built a simple blind near the eastern edge, where deer would come to drink at dawn. In all those years, I had never had a single problem with law enforcement. I followed every rule because I respected the land and the animals I hunted. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I parked my truck at the edge of Frank's property, checked my license one more time, and shouldered my rifle. The sun was just beginning to peek over the mountain ridge. I had been in my blind for maybe 20 minutes when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. A white SUV with county sheriff markings pulled up next to my truck. My heart sank a little, but I was not worried. I had done nothing wrong. The woman who stepped out of that vehicle changed my life forever. Sheriff Corinne Walsh was tall and broad-shouldered, with short gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to be looking for a fight. She wore her uniform like armor, and her hand rested on her service weapon as she approached my truck. I climbed down from my blind and walked toward her with my hands visible. I had learned long ago that cooperation was the best policy when dealing with law enforcement. "Good morning, officer," I said. "Is there a problem?" She did not return my greeting. Instead, she looked me up and down like I was something she had scraped off her boot. "License and registration," she barked. I pulled my hunting license from my wallet and handed it to her, along with my driver's license. She barely glanced at them before shoving them back at me. "This is private property," she said. "You are trespassing." "No, ma'am," I replied calmly. "I have permission from Frank Miller to hunt here. I have been hunting this land for 15 years. Her eyes narrowed, and I could see something dangerous flickering behind them. This was not about trespassing. This was about power, and she wanted to use hers against me. Sheriff Corinne stepped closer to me, invading my personal space in a way that felt both threatening and unprofessional. I could smell coffee on her breath and see the small veins in her eyes that suggested she had not slept well. "I do not care what Frank Miller told you," she said, her voice low and menacing. "I am telling you this is private property and you are trespassing." I kept my voice calm and respectful. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I have been hunting here with permission for 15 years. Frank knows I am here today. You can call him if you need confirmation." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Her face flushed red, and she took another step toward me. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" she shouted. "Are you questioning my authority?" "No, ma'am, I am just trying to explain the situation." She snatched my hunting license from my hand again, this time studying it more carefully. I watched her face change as she realized that everything was in order. My license was valid, my tags were current, and I was hunting during legal hours in a legal location. But instead of apologizing or simply leaving me alone, she doubled down. "This license looks suspicious to me," she said, holding it up to the morning light. "The dates look altered." My stomach dropped. I knew she was lying, but I also knew that her word would carry more weight than mine in any official proceeding. "Ma'am, that license was issued by the State Wildlife Department just last month. The dates have not been altered." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed causing pain. "That is not what I see," she said. "I see evidence of tampering. That makes this fraudulent documentation." She pulled out a citation book and began writing furiously. I stood there in shock, watching her manufacture charges out of thin air. This was not law enforcement. This was harassment with a badge. "You are also hunting without proper safety equipment," she continued, adding another charge to the growing list. "Where is your hunter orange vest?" I pointed to the bright orange vest hanging clearly visible in my truck. She glanced at it and shrugged. "Not properly displayed during hunting activities," she said, writing another citation. By the time she was finished, she had cited me for trespassing, fraudulent documentation, and 3 safety violations that did not exist. The total fines came to over $800. "You have 30 days to pay these fines," she said, handing me the citations with that same cruel smile. "If you fail to pay, a warrant will be issued for your arrest." I looked down at the papers in my hand, feeling a mixture of rage and helplessness that I had never experienced before. Everything about this encounter was wrong, but I was powerless to stop it. "This is not right," I said quietly. "What did you say to me?" Her hand moved back to her weapon. "Nothing, ma'am. Thank you for your time." She climbed back into her SUV and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the valley that had been my refuge for so many years. But it was not my refuge anymore. It was her hunting ground, and I was the prey. As I packed up my gear and headed home, I made myself a promise. I would fight these charges through every legal channel available. I would prove that she had lied and abused her authority. I had no idea how naive that promise would turn out to be. The first thing I did when I got home was call Frank Miller. He was 82 years old and had owned that land for 40 years. When I told him what had happened, he was furious. "That woman has no right to harass you on my property," he said. "I will call the sheriff's department and straighten this out." But when Frank called, he was told that Sheriff Karen was not available and that all complaints had to be filed in writing. When he filed his written complaint, it disappeared into the bureaucratic void. No one ever called him back. I decided to hire a lawyer. Tom Bradley had handled legal issues for my family before, and he was familiar with hunting regulations. When I showed him the citations, he shook his head in disbelief. "These charges are ridiculous," he said. "Any judge should be able to see that this is harassment." We prepared our defense carefully. Frank Miller agreed to testify about the hunting permission. I gathered photographs of my properly displayed safety equipment. Tom obtained a certified copy of my hunting license from the State Wildlife Department, proving that it had not been tampered with. But as we prepared for court, I started hearing disturbing stories about Sheriff Karen from other people in the community. There was Jim Patterson, who had been cited for speeding when he was actually parked on the side of the road, helping a motorist with a flat tire. The citation stood despite witness testimony and photographic evidence. There was Sarah Williams, who had been arrested for disorderly conduct after she questioned why Corinne had pulled her over. Sarah spent a night in jail, and the charges were only dropped after she agreed not to file a complaint. There was Mike Torres, who had been cited for hunting violations on his own property. When he tried to fight the charges, he discovered that Corinne had filed a report claiming he threatened her with his rifle. Mike had never even removed his rifle from his truck. A pattern was emerging. Sheriff Corinne was using her badge to settle personal grudges and flex her authority over anyone who challenged her, and the system was protecting her every step of the way. Our court date arrived on a gray November morning. I sat in the small courtroom with Tom, feeling confident that justice would prevail. We had the evidence. We had the witnesses. We had the truth. Judge Robert Henley had been on the bench for 20 years. He was also Corinne's brother-in-law. When Corinne took the stand, she told a completely different story than what had actually happened. In her version, I had been belligerent and threatening. I had refused to produce identification. My hunting license had obvious signs of tampering. I had been hunting without proper safety equipment and had become hostile when she tried to educate me about hunting regulations. She lied with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. She lied with the authority of her badge and the weight of the system behind her. When I took the stand to tell my side of the story, Judge Henley barely listened. He interrupted me repeatedly, questioned my motives for hunting on that particular day, and suggested that I should be grateful Corinne had not arrested me for threatening an officer. Frank Miller's testimony was dismissed as the confused ramblings of an old man. The certified hunting license was ignored. The photographs of my safety equipment were deemed irrelevant. Judge Henley found me guilty on all charges. He reduced the fines to $600, but added court costs that brought the total back up to $800. He also ordered me to complete a hunter safety course, despite the fact that I had been hunting legally for over 20 years. As I walked out of that courtroom, I realized that I had been fighting the wrong battle. This was not about justice or truth or following the law. This was about power and who had it. Sheriff Corinne had it. Judge Henley had it. I did not. But power is not permanent, and sometimes it can be purchased. I spent the next 3 weeks in a dark place. I paid the fines because I had no choice, but the injustice of it ate at me like acid. I could not hunt. I could not find peace. Every time I thought about that morning in Miller's Valley, I felt the same helpless rage. My wife Sarah tried to comfort me, but she could see that something fundamental had changed. The man who had always believed in following the rules and trusting the system was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone who understood that sometimes the system fails and you have to create your own justice. I started researching Sheriff Corinne Walsh. I wanted to understand who she was and how she had gained so much unchecked power in our small community. What I found made my blood boil. Corinne had been sheriff for 8 years, but she had never actually won a contested election. She had been appointed to fill a vacancy when the previous sheriff retired, and she had run unopposed in every election since then. No one had ever challenged her because everyone was afraid of her. Her department had one of the highest complaint rates in the state, but most complaints were dismissed as unfounded. The few that were investigated were handled internally, and Corinne always cleared herself of wrongdoing. She had been married 3 times. Her first husband had left town abruptly after filing for divorce. Her second husband had been arrested for domestic violence, but claimed that Corinne was the aggressor. Her third husband was Judge Henley's brother, which explained the cozy relationship between Corinne and the court. But the most interesting thing I discovered was how Karen spent her free time. She was an avid hiker. Every weekend, she could be found on the mountain trails that crisscrossed our county. She had even been featured in the local newspaper as an advocate for keeping the trails open to public use. Her favorite hiking spot was a place called Eagle Ridge Trail. It was a beautiful 5-mile loop that offered stunning views of the valley below. The trail was popular with tourists and locals alike, bringing in revenue for local businesses and providing recreation for families. That was when I started digging into property records. Eagle Ridge Trail crossed through 3 different parcels of private land. 2 of the parcels were owned by the county and were properly designated for public use. But the third parcel, the one that included the most scenic overlook and the main parking area, was privately owned. The owner was a man named Robert Chen, who lived in California and had inherited the land from his grandfather. According to the property records, Chen had never formally granted public access to his land. The trail existed because people had been using it for decades, and no one had ever challenged their right to be there. I did more research into property law and discovered something interesting. In our state, landowners have the absolute right to control access to their property. They can allow public use, or they can restrict it entirely. They can even change their minds at any time. If someone were to purchase Chen's property, they could legally close the trail immediately. I found Chen's contact information and learned that he had been trying to sell the property for 2 years. He was asking $48,000 for 23 acres of mountain land with trail access and scenic views. In California real estate terms, that was practically giving it away. I called Chen on a Thursday evening. He was tired of dealing with the property from 2,000 miles away. He was tired of the tax burden and the liability issues that came with allowing public access to his land. "Are you interested in buying it?" he asked. I looked out my window toward the mountains where Karen Walsh spent her weekends, hiking and feeling superior to everyone else in the county. "Yes," I said, "I am very interested." That night I did not sleep. I was too busy planning. Buying 23 acres of mountain property was not a decision I made lightly. Sarah and I had been saving for years to pay off our mortgage early, and this purchase would wipe out most of our savings. But some things are worth more than money. Justice is one of them. I called Tom Bradley, my lawyer, and asked him to handle the property transaction. I told him I wanted to buy some land for investment purposes, which was not entirely untrue. I was investing in my own peace of mind. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked when he saw the price. "That is a lot of money for land you have never even seen." "I am sure," I said. The legal process took 3 weeks. Chen was eager to sell, and there were no complications with the title. Tom made sure that all the paperwork was perfect, all the surveys were accurate, and all the tax obligations were clear. On a cold December morning, I became the owner of 23 acres on Eagle Ridge Mountain, including the main parking area and the scenic overlook that made the hiking trail famous. The first thing I did was visit my new property. I drove up the winding mountain road to the parking area where Karen's patrol car was a regular fixture on weekend mornings. The place was beautiful, I had to admit. Rolling hills stretched out toward the horizon, and the morning mist clung to the valleys below. I could see why people loved hiking here. I could also see why they took it for granted. The second thing I did was contact a surveyor to mark the exact boundaries of my property. I wanted no confusion about where my land began and ended. The survey revealed that the parking area, the first 2 miles of trail, and the scenic overlook were all on my property. The third thing I did was contact a sign company. No trespassing signs are not expensive, but I wanted mine to be perfect. I ordered professional-grade aluminum signs with clear, bold lettering. I also ordered smaller signs that explained the penalties for trespassing on private property in our state. According to state law, trespassing on posted private property was a misdemeanor punishable by up to 90 days in jail and a $500 fine. More importantly, property owners had the right to have trespassers arrested and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I spent a Saturday morning installing the signs at every access point to my property. I placed them at the entrance to the parking area, at the trailhead, and at 50-yard intervals along the property line. Each sign was properly posted according to state regulations, making it impossible for anyone to claim they did not know they were trespassing. I also installed a chain and lock across the entrance to the parking area. The chain was heavy-duty steel, and the lock was the kind used by the Department of Transportation on highway gates. It would not be easy to cut or break. As I worked, I thought about Corinne Walsh and all the people she had harassed and humiliated over the years. I thought about Frank Miller, who had been ignored when he tried to defend me. I thought about Jim Patterson and Sarah Williams and Mike Torres and all the others who had been victimized by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. The system had failed all of us. But sometimes when the system fails, you have to create your own justice. I finished installing the last sign just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. My property was now properly posted and legally secured. Anyone who entered without permission would be trespassing, and I had every right to have them arrested. That night, I called the county sheriff's department and spoke to the dispatcher. I want to report that I have purchased property on Eagle Ridge and that it is now posted against trespassing, I said. I want to make sure all your officers are aware that the area is no longer open to public use. I will make a note in our system, the dispatcher said. I knew that note would find its way to Corinne Walsh eventually. I also knew that she would not believe it until she saw it for herself. I did not have to wait long. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with a light snow falling on the mountain roads. I woke up early and drove to my property, parking on the public road just beyond my gate. I wanted to be there when Corinne discovered what had happened to her favorite hiking spot. I did not have to wait long. At 8:15, her white county SUV came around the bend and stopped abruptly when she saw the chain across the parking area entrance. I watched from my truck as she sat there for a moment, probably trying to process what she was seeing. She got out of her vehicle and walked to the gate, examining the chain and lock. Then she saw the signs. Even from a distance, I could see her body language change as she read the words "no trespassing" and "private property." She walked back to her SUV and grabbed her radio. I could not hear what she was saying, but I could see her gesturing angrily toward the signs. Then she saw me sitting in my truck. Corinne Walsh marched toward me with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to intimidating others. Her face was flushed with anger, and her hand was resting on her service weapon. She looked like she was ready for a fight. I rolled down my window as she approached. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, pointing toward the gate. "Good morning, Sheriff Walsh," I said calmly. "The meaning of what?" "These signs, this chain. This is a public hiking trail." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folder containing copies of all my property documents. I had been carrying them with me every day since the purchase was finalized, waiting for this moment. "Actually, it is not," I said, handing her the deed. "This is private property, my private property." She snatched the papers from my hand and studied them with the same expression she had worn when examining my hunting license months earlier. But this time, she was looking at official county records that could not be dismissed or ignored. "This cannot be right," she said. "People have been hiking here for decades." "People have been trespassing here for decades," I corrected. "The previous owner chose not to enforce his property rights. I am choosing differently." Her face was getting redder by the minute. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to use her authority to get what she wanted. "You cannot just close a public trail," she said. "I am not closing a public trail. I am securing my private property, which is my right under state law." She handed the papers back to me with a dismissive gesture. "We will see about that," she said. "I am going to make some calls." "You are welcome to make any calls you want," I replied. "But while you are doing that, I should let you know that I will be pressing trespassing charges against anyone who enters my property without permission." The look she gave me could have melted the snow on the mountain. "Are you threatening a law enforcement officer?" she asked. "I am informing a law enforcement officer about the consequences of breaking the law," I said. "Something I thought you would appreciate." She started to say something else, but then stopped. For the first time since I had known her, Corinne Walsh was speechless. She had finally encountered a situation where her badge and her bullying tactics were useless. She walked back to her SUV and sat there for several minutes, probably making the calls she had threatened. I stayed in my truck, watching her and savoring the moment. This was what justice felt like. Not the cold, procedural justice of courtrooms and legal briefs, but the hot, personal justice of watching a bully realize that they had finally picked on the wrong person. When she finally drove away, she did not look at me. She stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched and her knuckles white on the steering wheel. I knew this was not over. Corinne Walsh was not the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had some power in this fight. The hunted had become the hunter. The phone calls started that afternoon. First, it was Tom Bradley, my lawyer. Corinne had contacted the county attorney's office, claiming that I was interfering with public access to recreational areas. She wanted to know if there was any legal way to force me to reopen the trail. "I told them there is not," Tom said. "You own the property and you have the right to control access." They were not happy to hear that. Next, it was the county commissioner. He had received calls from angry hikers who had driven up to Eagle Ridge only to find the trail closed. They were demanding that the county take action to reopen public access. "I understand your position," the commissioner said, "but this is creating problems for the county. Is there any way we can work out a compromise?" "I am open to discussing a compromise," I said, "but it would have to include a formal apology from Sheriff Walsh for her harassment and abuse of power." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "That is not likely to happen," he said finally. The local newspaper got involved next. A reporter named Janet Mills called me for an interview about the trail closure. She had received dozens of complaints from hikers and wanted to hear my side of the story. I agreed to meet with her, but I was careful about what I said. I explained that I had purchased the property as an investment and that I was simply exercising my legal rights as a landowner. I did not mention my history with Corinne Walsh or my real motives for closing the trail. "But surely you understand that people are upset," Janet said. "This trail has been used by the public for generations." "I understand that people are upset," I replied. "But being upset does not give them the right to use my property without permission." The story ran on the front page of the Thursday paper under the headline, "Popular Hiking Trail Closed by New Owner." The article was balanced and factual, but the comments section was brutal. I was called selfish, greedy, and vindictive. Several people suggested that the county should use eminent domain to force me to sell the property back. But not all the feedback was negative. I received a phone call from Mike Torres, the man who had been falsely cited by Karen for hunting on his own property. "I just wanted to say thank you," Mike said. "I know why you really closed that trail, and I think it is brilliant. That woman has been terrorizing this community for years, and nobody has ever stood up to her." Similar calls came from Jim Patterson and Sarah Williams, and several other people who had been victims of Karen's abuse. Word was spreading that this was not really about hiking trails or property rights. This was about accountability. Karen tried to rally support from other law enforcement agencies, but she found little sympathy. The state police and the county attorney's office were well aware of her reputation and her pattern of questionable behavior. They were not willing to go out on a limb to help her regain access to a hiking trail. She also tried to organize a boycott of my small contracting business, but it backfired. For every customer who canceled their service, two more called to hire me. People were choosing sides, and many of them were choosing mine. The most satisfying call came from Frank Miller, the old man whose property I had been hunting on when this whole mess started. "I heard what you did up on Eagle Ridge," he said. "That is the smartest thing anybody has done in this county in 20 years. Karen Walsh has had it coming for a long time, and I am glad somebody finally gave it to her." 3 weeks after I closed the trail, Karen made one final attempt to assert her authority. She showed up at my house with a citation for operating a business without proper permits. I handed her a copy of my business license, which had been current for 12 years. She never bothered me again. 6 months later, Sheriff Karen Walsh announced that she would not be seeking re-election. The official reason was that she wanted to spend more time with her family, but everyone in the county knew the real reason. Her credibility had been destroyed, and her support had evaporated. The trail closure had become a symbol of her inability to solve problems through legitimate means, and it had emboldened her victims to speak out against her. 3 people filed to run for sheriff in the next election. All 3 promised to reform the department and restore public trust in law enforcement. Karen's 8-year reign of terror was finally coming to an end. But the story was not over yet. A month before the election, I received an unexpected visitor. Judge Robert Henley, Karen's brother-in-law, came to my house on a Saturday evening. He looked tired and defeated, like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What happened in my courtroom was wrong. I let family loyalty cloud my judgment, and I perverted justice as a result." I invited him in for coffee, and we talked for 2 hours. He told me about the pressure he had felt to protect Karen, about the corruption that had infected the local justice system, and about his regret for the lives that had been damaged by his decisions. "I am not running for re-election either," he said. "It is time for someone else to sit on that bench, someone who will not be influenced by personal relationships." As for the trail, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I reopened it. But I did so on my terms. I established a foundation to manage public access to the property, with strict rules about behavior and environmental protection. Hikers who wanted to use the trail had to register in advance and agree to follow a code of conduct. Those who violated the rules would be banned permanently. I also installed a memorial plaque at the scenic overlook. It was dedicated to all the victims of abuse of power, and it included a simple message: justice delayed is not justice denied. The trail reopened on the first anniversary of my confrontation with Corinne Walsh. Hundreds of people attended the ceremony, including many of Corinne's former victims. We hiked together to the Overlook, where I gave a short speech about the importance of standing up to bullies and fighting for what is right. Frank Miller, now 83 years old, was there with his family. Mike Torres brought his wife and children. Jim Patterson and Sarah Williams stood together near the memorial plaque, reading the names of others who had been wronged by corrupt authority. "This is not about revenge," I told the crowd. "This is about accountability. This is about making sure that people in positions of power remember that they serve us, not the other way around." Corinne Walsh did not attend the ceremony, but I heard she was watching from the road below. I hope she understood the message. The new sheriff was elected by the largest margin in county history. She was a former state police detective who had campaigned on a platform of transparency and community service. One of her first acts was to establish a civilian review board to investigate complaints against law enforcement officers. The new judge was a young prosecutor from the state capital who had never lived in our county before. He had no family connections to protect and no political debts to repay. Justice had been restored, but it had come at a cost. I had spent $50,000 of my own money to buy the property and establish the foundation. I had endured months of stress and controversy. I had made enemies who would never forgive me for challenging their authority. But I had also gained something invaluable. I had proven to myself and to my community that ordinary people can fight back against corruption and win. Sometimes you have to think creatively. Sometimes you have to take risks. Sometimes you have to be willing to pay a price. But justice is always worth the cost.